Hello and welcome to the first ever IriusRisk Community Edition Ask Me Anything. I'm Claire Allen-Addy, Global Product Marketing Manager, and with me is James Rabe, our Senior Solution Architect. James is also a subject matter expert for IriusRisk threat modeling, so you're in very capable hands today. Thank you all for joining. You'll have the opportunity to ask your questions either within the Q&A chat box if you didn't already submit them ahead of time. So we'll make sure the ones that we have received get answered. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to James for a very short walkthrough of our platform before we go into Q&A.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Claire. So let's go ahead and just share out a community edition here. So if we're looking inside of this interface, right, obviously the first thing you see is we've got several different options up here at the top. We've got our dashboard, portfolio, projects interface. You've got the ability to work on different templates. And as we go through, I'll show you how to actually apply one of these templates to your project. Now, previously, I had went ahead and created this project. We're going to go ahead and just delete that for now, and then we'll come back in and create a fresh project, just so everyone can see what this looks like. So select a new project, provide a name that is unique-ish. Since everyone's in the same instance here, you have to have a unique project name. Go ahead and select create a project. And then now in the background, it's going to drop me in on our canvas. Now, obviously, this looks a little bit like Draw.io if you're familiar with that interface. And that's because that's what we've built our product around. So you have that familiar diagramming interface. So the first thing we have to do is place our trust zone. I'm just going to go ahead and say public cloud, and make this a very simple diagram. Toss an EC2 instance on there. We're going to toss an S3 bucket on there. We're going to place a firewall on there. And then we're going to provide some data flows between those different components. And then now we can go ahead and say update our threat model. Now, in this instance, now we've got the bare bones components here. Obviously, I have to have a trust zone. I have to place these components inside of a trust zone, which tells me what's my attack surface like, what's the likelihood of exploit against any of the different components on my diagram. So right now, when we see this updating threat model, it's going through and it's querying the libraries and it's pulling out all of the different, and I made a change right in the middle of that update. So it's going through and it's querying all of the different libraries and it's pulling out information about each one of these different components, and it's adding risks and threats into my library. So now if we jump over into the threats interface, you can see now I auto expand everything. I've got several threats that are being added to each one of my components. And then within each one of those threats, we're going to start seeing, a weakness and then countermeasures associated with each one of those. So, and then we have a similar view from our countermeasure interface, where we can actually go in and view the same information, but this is going to strip out all of the threats, and it's only going to focus on specifically the countermeasures, starting with per component. And you also have the ability to flatten this if you'd like to. So if you don't like this tree view, you can do flatten countermeasure view. And this is the same thing on the threats interface. And that allows you to see component, countermeasure, any tags that you've associated with it, what the priority is, what the cost to implement, what the source was. So you see on here, we have an R, which tells us this was a rules engine created countermeasure. You can designate different owners. Obviously, in my tenant, it's just me working inside of this community project at the moment. We have our test results, and then we have our expiration date on that countermeasure. So, again, a real brief overview inside of here. You also have some reporting options down here where you can generate different types of reports against your threat model. So this is the current risk summary report. Go ahead and download that. So, and this report's going to show us our current risks segmented by components. So if I click into one of these components, you can see I've got my threat name, and then I've got the individual threats inside of that use case. So my component, my use case, which use cases are just ways of us grouping and segmenting threats. And then we have our different threat names, our different risks, and then we have our controls, and then what status they are. Now, a bit of background information on how these statuses work with regard to countermeasures. Now, when you start off on a project, these countermeasures are all going to be in a recommended state. And that's because by default, we don't tell you what you need to do because every environment's going to be slightly different. So you have the option to either go through individually and start marking these countermeasures as required, or you can go through and you can apply different standards to your threat model. So you see, I've got this PCI DSS standard. If I select that, it's going to change the state of 8 countermeasures from a recommended to a required state. And then I apply that standard, and it's going to go through and start marking some of these as required. So effectively, I'm developing a plan to mitigate the risk in these areas. So, and with that, that's a pretty good overview. There's obviously a few things we've left out just because we don't want to take up all of our time. We want to move on to the question segment of today's session. So, Claire, do we have any questions from the audience?
I just wanted to let everybody know that if they wanted to see some more tutorials, we have got some new videos that we've uploaded onto YouTube. So it has on there everything from creating your first diagram, like James has just shown, to accessing reports and things like that. So I will post the link in the chat in just a second. But for now, the first question we've got that we'll kick off with: what items are required for a threat model diagram?
Yeah, no, great question. So we jump back over to the diagram interface. Now, I did allude to this a little bit earlier. So when you're making your diagram, a lot of people, when you first come out, you don't necessarily see this trust zone interface. So you will make the mistake, and I've done this many times, and you'll place a component outside of a trust zone. And if I go ahead and update the threat model, yeah, it says, hey, this has to be inside of a trust zone. So we drag and drop that, select and drag and drop that, and you'll see the highlight as I drag and drop that into my trust zone. See how the trust zone kind of turns purple there around the border. Once that's been dropped inside that trust zone, effectively what I've done now is I've assigned some kind of likelihood of impact. How trusted is this zone? So obviously public cloud is going to be slightly more trusted than, say, for example, this internet trust zone, right? Which we don't trust at all, right? It's the wild west of security. But in this instance, this has to be inside of a trust zone. Now, other items that are valuable for adding important context to your diagram. Obviously, you saw me draw a data flow here, and that data flow can be done either by selecting one of the small X's that are a little difficult to see. You see my little laser pointer there, you can see those show up. Or we can drag our arrow and pull this directly over, and then you have the ability to shape and mold your lines as you see fit. Now, this obviously provides that data flow context. I also have the ability to answer questionnaires about my different components, where in this example, I can say which kind of stride categories of threats apply to this. So if I select spoofing threats, it will show me what kind of spoofing according to a KPEC library. I can also assign different types of assets. And again, what this is doing is this is further refining my threat model and further determining, okay, so if I've got 2 different types of S3 buckets, one of them has just public data available, and the other one has extremely private, PHI, protected health information inside of that bucket. Which one should I prioritize? And the answer is obviously the one with EPHI on it. But by providing that asset marker on there, so we'll say PHI is being sent and received through our firewall, I can select done. Now I'm providing a prioritization for why should I address the threats on this component versus this component, right? I start to provide that context. Now, additionally, I can also provide data on my data flow diagram, or my data flow line right here. So you see we selected the data flow between our WAF component and our EC2 component. I can then select protected health information. I can place that on since it's being transported between these 2 components. I can also say maybe it's being done HTTPS, right? So I can start to add data flow tags onto this, and then those will be visually shown on my diagram. If I don't like the way that looks, I also have the ability to hide my data flow tags and my data flow assets, and then they're only visible when I hover over that item. That way, maybe I've got a lot of information on my diagram and I want to reduce how much I can see on here. that's perfectly fine as well. So questionnaires, data flows, and then making sure your components are inside of your trust zones. So good question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. It's also good to know that if you leave a component outside of a trust zone, that it doesn't allow you to update the threat model. It kind of stops you in your tracks, doesn't it, to say that you can't proceed. So that's handy.
Correct. Yeah,
And
it's all part of how that inherent risk is calculated. So if you're not inside of a trust zone, your likelihood of impact is going to be missing. So it kind of forces you to do the right thing.
Sure. And also the tags and the options for data flows are good. I know some of our customers say that they prefer to have sort of less visual noise, so they opt to have them off except when they hover. But of course, the choice is yours. Next question then: how can I remove several threats from my threat model? And actually, can I add an additional question? Why would a user want to do that? Why would they want to remove a threat from this?
Yeah, good question. So we go over to the threats interface, right? And part of our threat analysis process, like any kind of automated, I have a library, I have a set of functions. When I drag a component onto a diagram, it's going to generate a set of threats. Some of these threats may not be applicable to your environment. Maybe you're using a more secure cloud, or you're on a different platform, or you have certain technical controls that have already been implemented, or maybe you just want to reduce the scope of your threat model. So either A, I can go in and I can select my threat right here, and I can go over to my actions column. I have the ability to accept that risk, meaning that I'm not going to address it right now. Or I could remove it completely from my threat model by saying not applicable. And when I say not applicable, I have to provide a reason. So this threat is not applicable to my environment because reasons, right? Then I can say not applicable. And then now it's actually going to remove that from my threat model. Now I can always go back and re-add it if I want. So right now I have NA threats are hidden. If I select re-add, you can see now it's moved this to very critical, and my countermeasure progress has been moved to NA because we're not going to work on it. I can also bring that back and say undo not applicable. Now, in whatever response you provided on this answer, this will also be captured on your report when you run your current threat report. So if we just generate that real quick, and let's take a look at what that report looks like, you'll actually see all of the responses that you provided for NA are going to be available on this report. So technical threat report, we go to not applicable threats, and then if we navigate to that, I clicked the wrong one, sorry about that. So we go to not applicable threats. You can see the threat name, the component, and then the reason that I provided. So, again, it's generating that audit trail where you may have generated a threat model, but you want to demonstrate to an auditor, demonstrate to another security professional that, hey, that threat's not in there. We considered it. We found that it wasn't in scope for this. Now, obviously, you may have 50 or 60 threats in here, right? Depending on how you structure your threat model. Now, how do we go through and we want to remove a large quantity of them that we know, man, these just aren't applicable? I also have the ability to bulk action these items. So if I go through and select multiple, I go up to my drop-down vertical ellipses here, I have a bulk action, and then I can go to not applicable. And we're going to say, these are definitely NA for this environment. Okay, select not applicable, and then it's going to go through and remove these from my environment. Now, one of the most common items we talk about is how do we make sure that what we're getting out of this output is actionable, right? So think about for every single component you have on your diagram, right? From the pre-configured libraries, you're going to be generating anywhere from 2 to 5 threats, and obviously depends on what it is. If it's something like a web client or web server, it may generate even more. But for every component that I can remove from scope on my diagram, I can start to reduce the number of threats. And for every threat I can remove, I can start to remove the number of countermeasures. So for every component I remove, it removes 2 to 5 threats. For every threat I remove, it removes 3 to 5 countermeasures, right? So you can see how making sure your scope is very intentionally set, you can start to demonstrate and reduce the output that you're going to have. Now, a way you can visually demonstrate that is through the use of an out of scope component. So I use these quite frequently. So if I want to maybe diagram, on my diagram, I want to show that I have a firewall, but I don't necessarily want to, of course, my data flow lines now a little hidden. So let's bring that to the front. But I want to be able to show this, but obviously I'm just visually showing it on my diagram. I don't want it to actually impact. So basically I can create that visual where my firewall is being hosted or nested inside of my out of scope component. And then when I come over to my threats interface, I can actually go over and manually move that over. Now, in the enterprise edition of our product, we do have the ability to have that automatically mark these as out of scope, and that's a rule that you can create that will actually go through and do that for you anytime they're nested inside of the out of scope version. So you can see I've got my AWS WAF. I can go ahead and select all the different threats associated with that. See all of those there, and I can go ahead and move those. Looks like they've already been moved to not applicable, so we already did those earlier. But that's effectively how you would go through, and you can visually demonstrate that on your diagram using an out of scope component. I think I got both parts of that question. So the how and the why.
You did. Awesome. And I suppose it could also be used if, say, you had some third-party elements within there, some components that the responsibility didn't sit with you. So perhaps the out of scope could be used there as well to maybe highlight visually, these are the areas that we're not responsible for and the rest we are.
Yeah, you could, so for example, like with, Salesforce or something like that, where you have a shared responsibility model, you could set up something like, maybe I've got a public cloud for Salesforce. And what's nice about some of the components is you've got the flexibility to use things like empty components. If I want to visually demonstrate, so empty component, edit my details and say, maybe this is the Salesforce environment. And then I can go in and create controls that are going to be out of scope, right? Items that are part of their environment, but then I can have parts of their environment that maybe are in scope for what I'm going to work with. So for example, maybe we're responsible for edit details, user authentication process. Right. Maybe we're in control of several of the countermeasures and things like multi-factor authentication, and then user authorization. So parts of the functions that Salesforce has, it's in their environment, but we have the portion of those controls that we're going to be involved in, and then we have the portion of the controls that they're going to be involved in. But we can still model them if we choose to.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just go back to these questions here that we received. The next one is, what if we need an alternative component? So I think what they're saying is, what if within IriusRisk community, there's not the component that they're looking for? I mean, we have got a very long list, but this could happen.
Yeah, and I think, obviously I may have accidentally demonstrated this early, but so for example, right, you can see there's no Salesforce component in here, right? But I do have the ability to say, maybe I have an empty component, right? And what I can do with that, so let's just go ahead and create another trust zone over here, and we'll say internet trust zone, drop our empty component in. I can go through and grab that component, say edit details, and I'm just going to make this Salesforce proper, right? Now, as I go through, I'm creating a component. Now, I do have the ability, obviously these have these nice pretty pictures on them, right?
Yeah.
I want to add a picture on here. I do have the ability to come over and I can edit an image, and this will let me either upload, or I can put a URL for that image on here. And then as I work with this, I can also go into my threats interface, just update my threat model real quick, make sure that it's capturing our changes as we're going through and working on our threat model. We'll go ahead and flatten that threat view. So now that I've created effectively that other component, and I'll give this just a second to finish updating. I can do component. I can do my Salesforce component if I just want to look at one. So the first thing you notice in here is that we don't have any given threats associated with it, right? So because again, it's a brand new component. So let's go ahead and clear that filter, and let's go find that component on our diagram here, or excuse me, on our threats interface. Unflatten it for a second. So Salesforce, you see we don't have any threats at the moment. So first thing I want to do is come in here and create a different use case for it. So create a use case, and we could say these could be authentication-based threats. Now, as we're creating these, think about a use case as just a way to segment different types of threats. So you could have a use case which are authentication-based threats, that are authorization-based threats, that are logging and monitoring-based. There's not a correct way to generate nomenclature for use cases. It's really just based on whatever your organization is most familiar with. So I can go ahead and say create that use case, and then I can go ahead and start adding threats to that. So I could say user account is brute forced. Spell that correctly, brute forced, and unauthorized user is able to access sensitive data. Obviously, that's going to impact the confidentiality of that data. It may impact the integrity of that data. It may not have a huge impact on the availability of that data. Ease of exploitation, that's pretty low-hanging fruit. And then we can go ahead and say add threat. And then we've moved from we don't have a component to now we have a component for it, and we have the ability to go through and threat model each of those individually. And now that I've added that item, I can go ahead and add a countermeasure. So set sufficient password strengths and complexities. Okay. So I've gone from, again, no component to now I have countermeasures for that particular item. And I can continue adding those if I like. So enable MFA for user through single sign-on, or something like that. So allowing me to go through and create, a full scenario here and a full threat model, where before I didn't have a component for it. So, don't let our component library be a constraint for this item. Just because we do have a lot of components in here. I think the count's around, 550, something like that, 535. But if there are items out there where you need a component and you don't have one, you can create one from this interface. Now, there is a limitation here on the community edition. If you're using the full enterprise edition, we actually have a component editor that's available where you can build components, and then other members on your team can go through and use those, and you can automatically associate the risk patterns from your libraries, and you have a full component building interface that's a little more it's more scalable than just doing this on a one project basis. But again, it's a limitation with the community edition at the moment.
Good side note, thank you. I was just thinking, whilst you were alternating between the flattened view and the other view, there are some community users that are students and that are also very much in the early stages of their threat modeling journey. Apart from what we've spoken about, where you can prioritize accordingly, you can flatten the view, is there anything else, if this feels overwhelming for someone using their first sort of automated tool, perhaps they've been doing things manually before, are there any other tips within here that we could recommend?
Yeah, as far as like how, if I've got a ton of countermeasures and threats, how do I prioritize
Exactly.
them?
Yeah, exactly. It might feel a bit overwhelming if someone hasn't used something like this before.
Yeah, well, I think that's where, obviously we want to know what's our attack surface look like. If this is my first public facing item on here, you can even add, details and tags to things, and we could say, this is public facing, right? That way, as I come into my threats interface, I'll start to see that I want to prioritize threats against my firewall here. more so that I do something that's only internal facing, right? There's no external access to that. Or you have to go through several different layers of security. Now, obviously, we don't want to create that, soft underbelly, hard shell approach to how we manage our application security or infrastructure security. But when you go through and add those, you can actually add our tags column back in here. You'll be able to see that. Just open everything up here for you. You'll be able to see now we've got our public facing tags on here, so you can start to prioritize certain parts of your diagram over others. Now, if I go in and flatten this threat view, you'll also be able to see that our current risk, excuse me, which is my inherent risk to my threat model, I can sort based on that column. So if I hold the shift key down on my keyboard and I sort based on this, you'll be able to see that at the moment it's going to show me, I think that's sort completed. There we go. So I'll sort based on the other direction now. Give that a second to catch up. You can see I've got one critical here, so I have the ability to start working from my most critical down into my highs. And then you can see now we've removed these from our diagram. So these are going to be on the very low side. I think if I just go over and hide them as well, that'll further reduce my noise, down to a much lower layer. And then I can grab this and say, hey, what am I actually going to do with it, right? So maybe I'm going to move some of these into a required status.
Could you, in a second, explain the meaning behind required and recommended? Perhaps not everyone's familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. So when they land on your threat model, every countermeasure is going to reflect, and this is a bit of a crossover from where, what enterprise can do versus what community does, right? So inside of the libraries, the security content libraries we have that drives the function of, I see a component, I'm going to add a threat, I'm going to add a countermeasure. Inside of that library, all of your countermeasures have a state. Now, when we deploy content for customers and for community members, we have everything start off in a recommended state. Because like we said earlier, we're not going to tell you always have to do that item. But if an enterprise customer decides, I want to build a library and those items are always required, when they come into the threat model, they're going to start off in that required state, meaning that as a threat modeler, as a developer, I must implement that item. Now, you still have to prioritize them and get them into sprints and figure out when I'm going to prioritize them. But anything that starts off in a recommended represents that I don't have a plan for it. There's no plan to do this yet. But then once I transition it into a required status, now I've committed to, that's an item I need to work on. So even now further, if I go over into my countermeasure interface, you'll see that we can just look at only the required countermeasures. And I can filter by that if I want. So state required, so that I'm only looking at the countermeasures that are required. And then I can sort based on my priority. So I only have two that are affected a very critical threat. So I know immediately these are my two next steps, right? So I can filter based on threat. I can start working on those countermeasures, and then I can look at my countermeasure interface to make sure I have the correct one selected. So pretty straightforward. Good question.
Great. Thank you so much. We are almost at the half-hour point. We haven't got through all the questions. We'll get back to some of you individually that left your contact details, but perhaps a shorter one here. What is the purpose of the questionnaires? Because I saw you do that earlier on.
Yeah, what's the purpose of the questionnaire? So if we go back over, we actually have two separate questionnaires. One is what is called the architecture questionnaire, and it's accessible through this interface. Now, when I open this up, this is a little bit, underwhelming at the moment. We do have our templates, which can be imported from in here. Enterprise customers have the ability to add additional questionnaires up here. So if you have additional questions you want to collect data about as people are threat modeling, you can require them to fill those out. But this questionnaire applies to everything on our diagram. The other type of questionnaire we have is the component questionnaire. You can see I selected one component, and then I go to complete questionnaire. Now, and this will open up for me. Now I have the ability to answer questions specific to just one component. So if I grab my EC2 instance, say complete questionnaire, you can see now I have questions related to just my EC2 instance. I have the same stride questionnaire, and then I have the ability to assign assets. So, again, components that are questionnaires related to components only apply to single items within my diagram, versus the architecture questionnaire applies to my entire diagram as a whole.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, we will leave the questions there so that we finish on time. Thank you so much, James, for taking us through those. For those of you still with us, there's the link there to the playlist on YouTube if you want to recap some of the areas that we've spoken about. And then if you did want to recommend community to any co-workers and so on, the link is there as well. We will be doing these more frequently, so we will get in touch with you for the next one, most likely to be in May, and we hope to see you there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian. Have a great day, guys.